Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got your sources here, articles, notes, all sorts of things, and today we're diving into something huge. How markets, buying and selling, have seeped into areas of life where they didn't used to be. Our mission basically is to unpack all this material you sent, pull out the key ideas, the important stuff, and really try to understand how this spread of markets affects us, what the real implications are.
Yeah, and looking through these sources, it really paints a picture of the years before the 2008 crash as this peak time, sometimes called market triumphalism. It seems to have started gaining steam back in the early 80s, think Reagan and Thatcher, and then just kept going through the 90s with Clinton and Blair. The core belief then, according to this material, was really that markets were the main way, maybe the only way, to achieve public good. So the big idea running through everything here is that this expansion, this market thinking moving into places governed by, well, different rules, non-market rules, that's a really big deal in our time. It forces us to ask, as this buying and selling logic takes over more and more, is this actually the kind of society we want?
Okay, let's break that down. First off, just how far have markets actually spread? I mean, one thing that really jumps out from these sources is seeing for-profit companies running things like schools, hospitals, even prisons, things you'd normally think of as, well, public services. Yeah, it's kind of wild to see how much is now driven by profit, stuff the state or nonprofits used to handle.
Yeah.
And it goes further, right? The sources talk about outsourcing war to private military contractors. Apparently in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were actually more of these private contractors than U.S. soldiers on the ground. That's a massive shift.
It really is.
And it's not just war zones. Back home, private security has boomed. It says here that in the U.S. and Britain, there are now more than twice as many private security guards as public police officers. Makes you think, doesn't it? When security becomes something you mostly buy privately.
So that's the big picture expansion.
Right. But how does this market stuff show up in, daily life? One area the sources really focus on is just waiting in line, or rather, not waiting. They talk about how we went from maybe, discreet little bribes to just openly paying to cut in line, jumping the queue, as they put it. You see it all the time. Airports have fast track, right? Standard for business class. Amusement parks, too. Universal Studios sells passes, costs about double the normal ticket, just so you can skip the lines. And the sources mentioned people kind of lamenting this, saying the theme park line used to be this great equalizer. Everyone waited together, rich or poor.
Well, from a purely economic standpoint, the argument is that long lines are wasteful, inefficient. So letting people pay to jump the queue, theoretically, improves efficiency. People price their time, essentially.
Right, if your time's worth more, you pay.
That's the idea.
But it's even created whole new jobs, like professional line standers.
Get out.
Yeah. The sources mentioned people getting paid to wait for free Shakespeare tickets in Central Park. Apparently, demand was insane when Al Pacino was in it, or for seats at congressional hearings, even Supreme Court arguments. People really, really don't want to wait.
Oh.
And then there's the whole concierge doctor thing. You pay this hefty annual fee. Could be $1,500, could be $25,000 for priority access. Same-day appointments, the doctor's cell number, the works. They mentioned one practice, MD2, charging like $15,000 a year per person.
15 grand.
Promising absolute unlimited access to a doctor who only sees 50 families. The waiting room's apparently like a Ritz-Carlton lobby.
So what this does, right, is it really highlights the difference between markets and queues for deciding who gets what. Markets use willingness to pay. Queues use willingness to wait. And the sources ask a good question. Is willingness to pay automatically a better measure of who values something most or who needs it most compared to willingness to wait?
Good point.
Think about the Yosemite example in the sources. People were scalping campsite reservations on Craigslist for like $100, $150 a night, even though the Park Service forbids it.
And people were furious.
Oh, yeah. There was this editorial headline mentioned, "Scalpers Strike Yosemite Park. Is Nothing Sacred?" Really captures the feeling.
Yeah.
And there are two main reasons for that outrage, according to the material. One is fairness, obviously. It prices out people who don't have a lot of money.
Right.
But the other objection is deeper. It's about corruption or improper valuation. The idea that national parks are special, places of wonder, not just things to be bought and sold. Scalping access feels wrong, like a sacrilege.
That idea of something being sort of sacred, beyond market value, it reminds me of the Bruce Springsteen example they brought up.
Oh, yeah.
He deliberately set his ticket prices way lower than he could have gotten. Like $95 max, when the Rolling Stones were charging $450. So Scalpers had a field day, and economists calculated he lost out on maybe $4 million just for that one concert.
Yeah.
But he chose to stick to a different norm,
Yeah.
not just pure profit.
Exactly. And that's the core point here, really. This shift from first come, first served to you get what you pay for isn't just procedural, it's a shift in the underlying ethic. The ethic of the queue versus the ethic of the market.
And how you allocate it changes what it means.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Another big area is using money as incentives, trying to, nudge behavior with cash.
Right, and this ties into that whole economic view of life, like Gary Becker's idea. He argued economics isn't just about money, it's a way to understand all human choices. The assumption is people are always calculating costs and benefits, even if they don't realize it. So economics becomes this imperial domain explaining everything. Okay, so if economics explains everything, what happens when we start using cash incentives for, like, social issues or doing good things? The sources have some pretty striking examples. There's the really controversial one, offering cash for sterilization, like $300 for drug-addicted women,
Yeah, that one's tough.
or paying people for healthy habits, taking meds, quitting smoking, losing weight. One study mentioned paying people about $378 on average for losing 14 pounds. Then there's cash for grades, $100 for passing an AP test, even paying kids to read books.
And naturally, these things raise big moral questions, which the sources dig into. First, there's the coercion issue. If you offer money for sterilization to someone who's poor or addicted, how free is that choice, really? Where's the line between an incentive and, well, basically coercion?
Right.
Then there's the bribery objection. For health or grades, are you getting people to do the right thing? Sure, but maybe for the wrong reason. The sources call them health bribes. Does paying someone to be healthy or study hard somehow cheapen the act itself? Does it erode their own motivation, their self-respect?
This leads to that really interesting, kind of mind-bending distinction the sources make. The difference between a fine and a fee.
Ah, yes.
Think library fines for overdue books. That implies you did something wrong, right? A penalty. But video stores, eventually their late charges just became fees, the cost of keeping the movie longer.
Right.
A business transaction, the norm shifted.
That's a great example.
And they mentioned China's one-child policy. The penalty, the fine, is huge, over $30,000 in big cities. But for wealthy people, it's apparently starting to feel less like a fine for wrongdoing and more like just a fee you pay if you want a second kid.
Exactly. Which brings up that crucial question. Does putting a price on something change what it means? The sources use the super controversial idea of a market in procreation permits. Tradable vouchers to have kids?
Oh.
Economists might say, okay, that's efficient. Kids go to those willing to pay the most. Maybe the rich buy permits from the poor, reducing inequality.
The objections.
Oh, they're massive. Unfairness, obviously making kids a luxury good, bribery, paying people not to have children. And the big one, corruption. Does it create this mercenary attitude towards having children? Does it taint parenthood itself? The idea that you can buy the right to be a parent seems to corrupt the whole idea of unconditional love and responsibility.
Yeah, fundamentally.
And this fine versus fee thing pops up with the environment, too. Should polluting companies pay fines, framing it as morally wrong, or use tradable permits? What pollution is just a cost of doing business? Debates over things like carbon trading force us to ask, what attitude towards the environment do we actually want to encourage? Responsibility or cost management?
Which then links to carbon offsets, right?
Yeah.
Paying, was it $16.73 to offset a flight?
Right.
The sources say, okay, the impulse is good. People want to do something. But the danger is it becomes like buying forgiveness, paying money so you don't have to actually change your habits.
Exactly. The comparison they make is to medieval indulgences, paying to offset sins instead of, actually stopping sinning.
Oof. Yeah. Okay, let's turn to maybe the starkest area.
Yeah.
Markets and actual life and death. The sources talk about something called janitor's insurance, company-owned life insurance, or COI.
Right, where companies insure their employees' lives, but the company is the beneficiary.
Yeah, and the examples laid out here are, well, they're pretty grim. A company getting $339,000 when a worker died of AIDS. Family got nothing. A convenience store collecting $250,000 for a clerk killed during a robbery, offering the widow only $60,000.
Jeez.
Companies even collected payouts for employees killed on 9/11.
Wow.
And this wasn't small scale. Millions of workers were covered. It was like 25–30% of all life insurance sales in the early 2000s. U.S. banks held $122 billion worth by 2008.
Incredible.
The big controversy, as the sources point out, was often the lack of consent and just the huge gap between what the company got and any benefit offered to the employee's family, if anything, like Walmart offering a $5,000 death benefit while potentially collecting hundreds of thousands.
And this bumps up against that whole idea of insurable interest, doesn't it? The principle that you should only insure someone if their death would cause you a genuine financial loss. It was meant to stop insurance being just a gamble.
Exactly. Which leads to another market, viaticals.
Ah, yes. Buying life insurance policies from people who are terminally ill.
Right. Investors buy the policy at a discount, hoping the person dies soon so they get a higher return.
The moral issue there is just so stark. Your profit depends directly on someone dying quickly.
Yeah. And the sources mention it backfiring on investors sometimes, like when new HIV drugs came out in the 90s and people started living much longer.
Right, the expected returns vanished. They also mentioned this poor Idaho rancher who was supposed to die quickly but was still going strong at 84, much to the investors' disappointment.
Grim. And then there are death pools, just betting on when celebrities will die. The sources call it moral tawdriness, just the attitude it reflects.
You know, it's interesting. The sources give some historical context. Life insurance itself was seen as morally suspect for a long time, like gambling on death. That British law from 1774, the Assurance Act, was specifically about requiring that insurable interest to stop people gambling on strangers' lives. People were really reluctant, culturally, to treat death as a business. Agents had to work hard to overcome that.
But now we've gone even further, haven't we? Beyond viaticals for the terminally ill to life settlements, buying policies from healthy older people,
Yes.
and even spin life policies, where speculators basically set up a policy on someone just so they can sell it later.
Right.
The sources argue the basic moral problem. A stranger having a financial stake in your death is kind of the same whether they buy your existing policy or create one specifically for speculation.
And what does that mean for society when potentially millions of strangers, anonymously, have a financial interest in people dying sooner rather than later? It feels like that historical effort to keep insurance separate from gambling has completely broken down, especially with death bonds. They package these life settlements up like mortgages and sell them on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, they're involved. The potential market is huge, apparently $26 trillion in U.S. policies.
Wow.
Does bundling them up and making it anonymous make it okay? The sources suggest we're kind of returning to this speculative moral universe, betting against life itself.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. What about just commercialism? Advertising, branding, creeping into public and social life.
Oh yeah, it's everywhere.
Look at sports. The memorabilia business isn't just about fans getting autographs anymore. It's big business, brokered deals. Game-used stuff goes for insane money, like that Mark McGwire home run ball for $3 million.
And stadium names changing all the time, right? Tire Stadium becomes Comerica Park, Mile High becomes Invesco Field.
Yeah.
The criticism highlighted in the sources is that these aren't just buildings, they're often civic landmarks, places with shared memories. Changing the name for money erodes that civic connection, changes what the place means.
And inside the stadiums, you have the luxury skyboxes. The sources call them the sporting equivalent of gated communities.
Oh, yeah.
Stadiums used to be places where everyone mixed more. Now it's highly stratified. Even universities are doing it. Michigan Stadium had protests over skyboxes, changing the historic Big House. And there's even a tax break for college skyboxes.
And even the strategies like Moneyball and baseball. Using stats to find value.
Right.
Initially, it seemed like a way for poorer teams to compete. But ultimately, the sources say it favored the rich teams who could afford the best analysts and players identified by the metrics. Does that actually make the game better? Or does it change its character somehow?
Good question.
Yeah.
And then there's the really overt stuff. Your ad here culture. It gets really personal. Body billboards.
You're kidding.
No. That Casa Sanchez place offering free lunch for life if you got their logo tattooed. Temporary forehead ads? Someone apparently sold Terminat ad space on their forehead for $10,000 to pay for their kids' education. The sources quote these newspaper headlines that just capture the feeling. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from ad barrage. Ads are here, there, everywhere.
And it seeps into public services, too. Municipal marketing. Cities selling ad space on subway stations, Barclays Center in Brooklyn. Proposals for ads on nature trails, police cars, even fire hydrants sponsored by KFC.
KFC fire hydrants. Seriously.
Really? The worry is just bringing commercialism right into the core of civic life.
And schools. That feels particularly iffy. Channel 1, forcing kids to watch ads.
Right.
Companies creating sponsored educational materials, Hershey's, McDonald's, Exxon, even the American Coal Foundation pushing their agenda via Scholastic. Campbell's soup kits, candy being compared to volcanoes, Tootsie Roll math kits,
It's incredible.
and schools selling naming rights. A ShopRite gym.
Yeah.
A high school in Philly had a whole price list, $5 million for the school name, $10,000 for the principal's office.
Unbelievable.
Ads on report cards, McDonald's giving free Happy Meal for good grades.
So the overall critique, which the sources state quite powerfully, isn't just, is this exchange fair? It's that this constant commercialism can actually coarsen hearts, minds, and communities. One quote calls it a kind of pollution. It just intrudes and spoils things, changes their character, like hearing corporate slogans constantly during a baseball game. It just feels off.
Okay, so we've seen markets expand everywhere, but why is this a problem? What's fundamentally wrong with it, according to these sources? They seem to boil it down to two main objections.
That's right. The first is the fairness objection. Basically, are market choices really fair if people are acting out of desperation or severe inequality? Think about the examples of poor people selling kidneys or blood. Is that truly a free choice? So fairness requires looking at the background conditions. Does inequality undermine real consent?
Right, makes sense.
The second big one is the corruption objection. This is the idea that market values themselves can damage or dissolve important non-market norms and attitudes. Things like how we value children, how we think about the environment, civic duty, moral obligations. Putting a price on these things, the argument goes, can degrade their meaning, corrupt them.
And how does that happen?
A key way is through the crowding out effect. The sources really emphasize this. Introducing market incentives can actually push out or weaken existing non-market motivations like altruism or civic spirit.
Like the Israeli daycare example.
Exactly. That's the classic case. They put a fine on parents who were late picking up kids, hoping to reduce lateness, but lateness increased.
Because parents just saw it as a fee.
Precisely. They stopped feeling a moral obligation to the teachers and just saw it as, okay, I can pay for being late.
Yeah.
It became a market transaction. And interestingly, even when they removed the fine later, the lateness persisted. The moral norm had been damaged, crowded out by the market norm.
Wow, that's powerful.
And the sources point out that standard economics can't easily explain this or judge if losing that norm is bad. You need moral psychology, philosophy. You have to ask, does pricing something change its fundamental nature?
Yeah, that really clicks. It's like,
Yeah.
you can buy things that look like the real thing, but aren't. The sources mention apologies, wedding toasts, even friendship. You can hire someone to act like a friend, but it's not the same, is it?
Not at all.
Or elite university admissions.
Yeah.
If they just auction seats to the highest bidder, the whole idea of it being an honor, something earned, would just evaporate. Selling it diminishes it.
Exactly. Which leads to that really wild idea from some economists like Robertson and Summers mentioned in the material.
Which one?
The idea that virtue, altruism, generosity, civic spirit is like a finite resource, like oil. It gets used up.
Seriously.
Yeah. So the argument is you should conserve it. Rely on markets whenever possible so you don't deplete people's goodwill unnecessarily. Pay people instead of asking them to volunteer, basically.
But the counter-argument in the sources feels much more intuitive. That virtue isn't like oil, it's like a muscle. It gets stronger the more you use it.
You're right.
And if society relies too much on markets, these important virtues, kindness, civic participation, generosity, they just wither away because they're never exercised. So it all comes back to this fundamental question these sources raise. Is there something just wrong with a society where pretty much everything is up for sale? Are there some moral goods, some civic values that markets don't respect and that money just can't or shouldn't buy?
And the takeaway really seems to be that deciding how we distribute things, markets, cues, need, whatever, isn't just about efficiency. It's a moral decision. It reflects how we value those things and what kind of relationships and attitudes we want to encourage between people. Market logic has its place, obviously, but it can't be the only logic. We need moral reasoning, too.
So, as you're thinking about all this, maybe reflect on the examples we talked about. Which ones felt the most unsettling to you? Paying to cut in line, putting a price on health or having kids, betting on death, seeing ads plastered everywhere, even in schools. Why did that particular thing feel wrong? What does your gut reaction tell you about the kinds of things, goods, relationship, values that you think should be kept apart, protected from the logic of the market? Something to mull over.